out of the left of 50 or 60 years ago and beginning in these smoky seminar rooms came this completely new idea of identity, which I'll repeat, you refer to as the identity synthesis. And I like that a lot just because it's not pejorative at all, which makes it easier to talk about. So it's called, or you refer to it as the identity synthesis because you write that it came out of three main movements, and these are postmodernism, postcolonialism, and critical race theory. And this might be an indictment of my show, but none of these three movements has really come up other than in passing. So we don't have to be super thorough here. And I know this is quite basic for you, but in the interest of better understanding the identity synthesis and where it came from, could you maybe share just what the central tenets of each of these three individual movements is or was?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. I don't want to claim, but I'm going to summarize all of these movements in their entirety. But I'll show you
Yeah,
how
of course not.
sort of each of these movements influenced what I'm calling the identity synthesis, right? And so I think the story, and by the way, some conservatives who've written about the origins of quote unquote wokeness talk about cultural Marxism. They think it's just sort of you take Marxism, you stick culture in it, and then you have what's going on today. And I think that's a profound misunderstanding of the actual history. And so my history starts with Michel Foucault and other thinkers who are broadly part of the postmodern and post-structuralist movement in post-war Paris. And what really animates Foucault is a deep skepticism about what he calls grand narratives. So he thinks that we have these sort of broad structuring sets of ideas and ideologies that sort of try to make sense of the world and get at something like truth. And he becomes profoundly skeptical about the ability of him to explain the world. And that sets him against liberalism, against some of the universalist and humanist ideals that I've described earlier. But it also sets him against Marxism, which he also thinks makes these sort of grand claims about how history is going to play out, but can't really be justified. So the core of his thinking becomes a deep skepticism about any form of universal truth or any form of truth at all. A deep skepticism that we can really understand how the world is and what is true and what is untrue. A great emphasis on the way in which the terms we use, the kind of discourse that's prevailing in our society determines power relations. So power for Foucault is not up-down, it's not top-down. It's not from the president down through the army to cops to what you're doing on the street. It's, by having this conversation, we are exercising power in a discourse in a way that's going to constrain other people. And he becomes deeply skeptical, therefore, of basic identity categories. So Foucault is himself, as we would put it, a gay man, but he doesn't believe that the term homosexual is a useful term. He thinks that in itself is constraining and exercising power in really problematic ways. And so what you end up with is a deep skepticism about truth and a deep skepticism about the viability of basic identity categories. And you really get to quite a nihilistic view of politics in which you can disrupt a discourse at any one point, but you can't really make progress because, as he explains in an exchange with Noam Chomsky, but what would we judge whether something is progress or not? So all you can do is to disrupt discourses, and that's about it. So that's sort of the first step. The second step comes with post-colonial thinkers. And in particular, important is Edward Said, a Palestinian origin professor at Columbia University, where he spent most of his scholarly life, who takes the way in which Foucault talks about discourses, but he makes it more political, right? He says, look, Foucault is really right and so on, that these discourses are really powerful. And that, in fact, helps to explain how the West, the Occident, has exercised power over the East, the Orient. They've orientalized these countries, and that is actually part of how they were able to build empires and exploit them and so on and so forth. But he wants to go beyond Foucault and saying, you know what, if we recognize these discourses and that they're unjust, we can change them And that in itself would be a liberatory act. So if we sort of get rid of these sort of simplistic ideas about what the Orient is, it's actually going to be a tool of power for oppressed people in those colonized or formerly colonized countries. So he sort of politicizes discourse critique. It becomes something that's really a tool of political influence and power in his mind. The second key figure in the post-colonial tradition is Gayatri Spivak, also at Columbia University as it happens, but a literary scholar in comparative politics of Indian origin. And what she's saying is, people like Foucault, they can say, there's no identity categories, and I'm not going to speak for anybody, because perhaps a proletarian in Paris who's literate, who's gone to school, who has certain kind of resources, can in fact speak for themselves. But I'm concerned, for example, over people in India who may not have had the opportunity to go to school, who are illiterate, who are even more powerless, who are even more poor, and they cannot speak for themselves. The subaltern, as she calls them, cannot speak for themselves, and therefore we need to speak on their behalf. Now, this creates a problem because Spivak bought the critique of basic identity categories that Foucault and later Derrida and others put forward. But she still wanted to speak on behalf of these identity categories. And so she comes up with a slightly puzzling term of strategic essentialism. So she's saying this essentialist accounts of identity that we normally use to say, you're a man, this person is Indian, this person is Hispanic, those are kind of wrong. But for strategic purposes, we need to use those ideas because that's what's going to allow people to actually organize politically against those forms of oppression. And then we get, and I know it's a long story, but we're slowly coming to the end of it, to critical race theory. And here we are, among the world of Black, Hispanic, Asian American legal scholars who are trying to grapple with the success, but also the disappointments of the civil rights movement. And so Derek Bell, who really is the founder of critical race theory, spends a lot of the 1960s working for the NAACP, lawsuits to desegregate schools in the American South. But he becomes disillusioned with that enterprise because a lot of the clients on whose behalf he's arguing in court graduate high school before the school is ever integrated. And a lot of the time, these new schools aren't of very high quality. And sometimes Black kids are discriminated against in those schools. And so Bell comes in the 70s and early 80s when he really starts a scholarly career to a very pessimistic conclusion. And he says, first of all, that racism in America is permanent. America in 1975, or for that matter in 2005, is no better than it was in 1950 when Jim Crow was still on the books. Perhaps it's, racism is a little bit more subtle, it's transmogrified in certain ways, but really it's just the same old story. And secondly, he thinks that universalist solutions to these problems are misguided. That if Brown versus Board of Education, the great court decision putting an end to schools that are separate but supposedly equal, did not in fact help African Americans as much as it promised to, then perhaps it was a wrong decision. Perhaps we should have had schools that were separate but truly equal. So he really, in a fundamental way, breaks with the civil rights tradition. He mocks the main songs of the civil rights movement. And then finally, we have Kimberly Crenshaw, one of his students, who becomes very influential, who sort of comes up with the idea of intersectionality, just at first to describe ways in which you might be discriminated against because you have multiple identity characteristics. A factory in Michigan may not discriminate against white women, and may not discriminate against Black men, but discriminate against people who are both female and Black, against Black women. And that's a valuable insight, but it's then taken up to mean too much more far-reaching things by people who use the term without necessarily agreeing with Crenshaw. And the first is that, if you're a Black woman and I'm a white guy, I'm just never going to be able to understand you. There's just no real mutual understanding we can achieve or accomplish. And secondly, the idea that in order to be sort of part of a political movement, you sort of have to fight against all forms of oppression. And so in order for me to be an activist in good standing fighting against one kind of form of oppression, I need to also sign up against your understanding of the fight that you're engaged in against what you think of a different form of oppression. All right, so this is the identity synthesis. At this point, if you take the building blocks that each of this thinker has put in place and you add them together, you get something recognizably like the edifice we have today. So from Foucault, you take the rejection of universal truth, the rejection of the idea that some things are true and other things are false. From Said, you're going to take this politicized form of discourse analysis, in which the way to have political change is to, write a cultural criticism of a Barbie movie in a way that criticizes sort of lingering patriarchy in the movie and manages to invert the power relations. You see a lot of that kind of stuff going on today. From Spivak, we take these forms of strategic essentialism, which help to answer some of the questions you asked earlier about why is it that we're taking these 7-year-old kids and putting them into these different identity groups? Because we're saying for strategic purposes, we should teach them to think as though these essentialist accounts of their identity are true. They need to identify by their race, even though we think race is a social construct. From Bell, we're going to take the deep skepticism about the possibility of any form of progress and a fundamental rejection of the idea that we remedy injustice by living up to universal standards rather than giving up on those kind of universal standards. And then from Crenshaw, we're going to take, or from the interpretation of Crenshaw, we're going to take the skepticism about our ability to understand each other, and the demand that to be sort of a good progressive, you have to sort of agree with progressives on all those different kinds of points. And I think if you take that, you start to see how it's the intellectual underpinning of a lot of the kind of political and social works of progressivism as it's emerged over the last decades.